They thought a simple zoning error was enough to break me, but they didn't realize that in this city, I am the one who holds the keys to everything. By the time they tried to pin a false accusation of an organized scheme on me, they had already signed their own death warrants. I've spent the better part of my 30s perfecting the art of being invisible. When you possess the kind of influence that can reroute a city's infrastructure or shutter a multinational corporation with a single phone call, you learn that silence is your most potent currency. I prefer my suits bespoke, my coffee black, and my presence entirely overlooked. But today, in the lobby of the Sterling Heights precinct, I wasn't just overlooked. I was treated like a stain on the polished marble floor. It started with a simple administrative error. My property management firm had been flagged for a zoning discrepancy, a clerical mistake so blatant it felt like a deliberate provocation. I walked into the precinct at 9 a.m. sharp, dressed in a muted charcoal blazer that cost more than most of the cruisers parked outside. I wasn't there to make waves. I was there to hand over a manila folder, have a sergeant sign off on the correction, and return to my penthouse. I need to speak with the clerk regarding the zoning permit for the downtown revitalization project, I said, my voice measured and calm. The officer behind the reinforced glass, a man with a thick, grease-stained neck and a badge that looked like it had seen more bar fights than actual justice, didn't even look up from his phone. He swiped across his screen with an agonizing slowness, ignoring me as if I were a ghost. "I'm waiting, officer," I said, a little firmer this time. He looked up then. His eyes scanned me, not with the professional courtesy one expects from public servants, but with a sneer that was dripping with casual, institutional condescension. He didn't see the CEO of the company that owned the very real estate the precinct was built on. He saw a black woman in a suit that he deemed too nice for someone of my appearance, and his mind immediately reached for the most tired, pathetic stereotypes in his arsenal. "Look, sweetie," he drawled, leaning back and putting his boots up on the desk. "You want to file a complaint, there's a kiosk in the back, or go back to whatever neighborhood you wandered out of and bother them. We're busy handling real business here." "I am not filing a complaint," I replied, my pulse steady. "I am submitting documentation for a permit. My firm owns the deed to the entire commercial block you're currently sitting in. I expect the paperwork to be processed." The laughter that erupted from the back office was like a gut punch. 3 other officers drifted toward the desk, their faces twisted into masks of mockery. One of them, a man with a mustache that looked like a bird's nest, nudged his partner. "Did you hear that, boys? She says she owns the building. Probably thinks she owns the city, too." They moved closer, creating a semicircle that felt less like a conversation and more like a tactical encirclement. The air grew heavy with that familiar, stifling scent of cheap coffee and unearned authority. They didn't just want me to leave. They wanted to strip away my dignity before they threw me out. "You know," the first officer said, standing up and towering over the counter, "I've seen people like you try to play this game before. Usually it ends with a trip to a holding cell for interfering with an investigation. You want to keep talking about owning the city?" He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. "I'm starting to think you look a lot like a person we've been looking for. In connection to a local organized scheme. Yeah, that's it. Witness reports say a woman fitting your description was spotted near a drop-off point for prohibited substances. You're looking real suspicious right now, ma'am." My blood ran cold, but not out of fear. It was the icy realization that this wasn't just arrogance. It was a setup. They were escalating a petty power trip into something far more dangerous. They wanted to pin an accusation of an organized scheme on me, an attempt to break my life with a heavy charge just because I dared to stand my ground. "You have no grounds for that," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "Don't I?" He reached under the counter, pulling out a pair of heavy metal cuffs. "We're going to search your bag. If we find anything, you're looking at a huge amount of time in a cage. And if we find illegal weaponry or those packets with substances, you'll be gone so long you'll forget what sunlight looks like." He signaled to the 2 men behind him. They moved in, their hands hovering near their holsters. They were preparing to plant evidence, to fabricate a narrative that would silence me permanently. I reached into my bag, not for my identification, but for my phone. "Don't move," the officer barked, his face flushing with a predatory excitement. "If you reach for anything, I will classify this as an assault on an officer. I'll make sure you never walk free again." I stared into his eyes, holding his gaze with a cold, terrifying intensity that made him blink. I hit the speed dial button on my phone, the one that connected directly to the office of the Chief of Internal Investigation. As the line clicked open, I spoke clearly, loud enough for every soul in that room to hear. "Gentlemen, you have exactly 30 seconds to back away from me, or I will ensure that every single one of you is stripped of your pension, your badge, and your freedom before the sun sets." The room went dead silent. The officer's hand hovered over the cuffs, his bravado flickering for a split second. Then he grinned, reaching for my bag with a violent shove. "Time's up," he whispered. As his fingers gripped my bag, I saw the back door to the precinct swing open, and a figure walked in. Someone who stopped dead in his tracks the moment he saw me standing there, handcuffed by his own men. The figure standing in the doorway was Chief Miller. I knew him. Everyone in the upper echelons of city governance knew him. He was a man who owed his position, his mortgage, and his daughter's private school tuition to the philanthropic fund I oversaw. He was the one who had personally signed the renovation permits for the very station we were standing in. And he was the one who had spent the last 3 years whispering in my ear about how he had everything under control. The officer holding my arm, oblivious to the sudden paralysis that had gripped the room, gave my shoulder a rough, jagged shake. "You heard the lady, Chief. She's got some fairy tale about owning the city. I was just about to see what she's hiding in this bag. Bet it's enough to get her an enormous sentence for dealing with that local network we've been tracking." Miller's face went the color of curdled milk. His eyes darted from the officer's calloused grip on my blazer to the manila folder I still clutched in my left hand. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water, his entire career flashing before his eyes in a rapid, silent slideshow. I didn't pull away from the officer. I stood perfectly still, my chin tilted just enough to signal that I was the one in command of the temperature in the room. "Chief Miller," I said, my voice cutting through the stale precinct air like a razor blade. "I believe your subordinate was just about to find something in my bag. Why don't you tell him exactly what he's going to find?" The officer sneered, clearly misreading the room. He turned to Miller, his voice thick with a mixture of idiocy and misplaced confidence. "Chief, step back. This woman is a hostile actor. She's resisting a lawful search regarding a high-profile case involving illegal weaponry and a distribution network. We've got her cornered." Miller's hands were shaking, just a fraction, but I saw it. He walked toward us, his footsteps heavy and hesitant, like a man walking toward his own execution. He stopped inches away, looking at his officer, then at me. The silence stretched, thin and brittle as glass. "Officer," Miller finally rasped, his voice sounding like gravel hitting a tombstone, "let go of her arm." "Sir?" The officer blinked, confused. "But the protocol, the investigation." "I said let go of her arm," Miller roared, the sudden ferocity of his voice making the other 2 officers in the room jump. The man released me as if I were made of molten lead. I straightened my blazer, smoothing out the fabric with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I looked at the officer, then at the 2 thugs standing behind him, and finally, I locked eyes with Miller. "Chief," I said softly, "you have a very creative team here. They seem eager to invent a life of crime for me. They mentioned that I was spotted with prohibited substances. They mentioned that I was involved in some organized scheme. I'm sure they have an entire report written up by now. I'd love to see it. Actually, I'd love to see all of them." Miller looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floorboards. "It's a misunderstanding, ma'am. A simple lapse in judgment. I will handle the disciplinary actions personally. We don't need to escalate this to the Internal Oversight Committee." "Oh, I think we do," I replied, pulling my phone from my pocket and showing him the screen. The call was still active. I hadn't been talking to the Chief of Internal Investigation. I had been talking to the lead investigative journalist for the city's largest news outlet, a woman who had been waiting for a reason to tear this precinct's reputation to shreds. The officer's face turned from a flush of anger to a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He finally understood. He looked at the window, at the street outside, and then back at me. He realized that the woman he had tried to humiliate wasn't just a pedestrian. She was the architect of his entire reality. "You don't understand," the officer stammered, his bravado finally evaporating. I was just doing my job. I had a tip. You had a target, I corrected him. I turned to walk toward the exit, my heels clicking sharply against the tile. But before I reached the heavy glass doors, a side office door slammed open. A man in plain clothes, looking far more dangerous and far more calculated than the uniformed officers, stepped out. He didn't look at Miller. He didn't look at the other officers. He looked directly at me, his hand resting casually inside his jacket, right where a holster would be. "Nobody is leaving until we verify exactly who you've been talking to," the man said, his eyes cold and devoid of any human warmth. "Because if that call reached who I think it reached, you aren't just walking out of here. We have a much deeper problem now." He signaled to the others, and the doors behind me locked with a metallic thud that echoed through the entire floor. I was no longer just dealing with a power trip. I was trapped in a room with people who knew their careers were already dead. And when a man with nothing left to lose realizes he's cornered, he doesn't play by the rules. He reaches for the weapon he's been hiding under the table. The man in plain clothes, who I recognized as Detective Vance, a shark in a cheap suit who had been trying to build a career on the back of fabricated arrests for years, wasn't bluffing. He didn't care about the chain of command, and he certainly didn't care about Chief Miller's panic. He was part of the infection, a core member of the organized scheme that had been siphoning city funds for over a decade. He knew that if the news report broke, his entire life of luxury, funded by back-alley deals and systemic corruption, would be dismantled. "Vance, stop!" Miller hissed, his face now a mask of desperation. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. Stand down, now!" Vance didn't even glance at the chief. His gaze remained locked on me, his eyes darting to my phone, which was still recording. "I know exactly who she is, Miller. She's the woman who thinks she can buy the truth. But in this room, the law is whatever I say it is." He took a step toward me, his movements calculated and predatory. "Give me the phone. Now." The atmosphere in the room shifted from confusion to a suffocating tension. The other officers, sensing that the lines of authority had completely blurred, slowly circled us. I didn't back down. I reached into my blazer pocket, but I didn't pull out the phone. I pulled out a small, metallic card, the black key card that unlocked the master servers for every government building in the downtown district. It was a digital kill switch. "You want to play the law?" I asked, my voice cold. "Let's talk about the law. You think you're in control of this precinct, Vance? You think you're untouchable because you have a badge and a gun?" I held the card up, the light catching the etched logo of the City Oversight Committee. "This card isn't just for building access. It's for the internal security cameras, the financial records, and the encrypted communication logs of every single officer in this building." Vance stopped in his tracks, his brow furrowing. "A bluff. You're trying to stall." "Am I?" I tapped the screen of my phone, triggering a command. Within seconds, the large wall monitors in the precinct's lobby, usually reserved for announcements and dull briefings, flickered to life. They didn't show the news. They showed live, high-definition footage of the internal office, where Vance and his associates kept their illicit records. The hidden safes, where they stashed the evidence of their organized scheme. The screen caught a young officer, one of Vance's subordinates, hastily trying to shred documents. The entire precinct gasped. Miller went rigid. The footage was clear, crisp, and damning. Vance's face contorted with pure, unadulterated rage. He realized then that I hadn't just called a journalist. I had bypassed the local system entirely and triggered a direct upload to the cloud-based server of the State Bureau of Investigation. There was no way to stop the data stream. It was already in the hands of the people who actually mattered. "You piece of—" Vance lunged forward, not for my phone anymore, but for me. He was going to use force to silence the source. But before his hand could make contact with my arm, the heavy, reinforced lobby doors were blown off their hinges. A flashbang grenade detonated, filling the room with a blinding, disorienting white light and a high-pitched ringing that brought every officer to their knees. Through the thick, swirling smoke of the hallway, silhouettes emerged, not police, but the specialized response unit of the city's internal security team, the people I had quietly alerted 5 minutes before I even stepped foot in the precinct. They moved with surgical precision, ignoring the screaming officers and heading straight for Vance. They didn't shout, "Police." They secured the perimeter with professional, terrifying silence. "We have the target," one of the agents said, his hand signaling his team to restrain Vance, who was currently thrashing on the ground. I stood in the center of the chaos, perfectly calm, as the smoke began to clear. Miller was cowering behind his desk, trying to salvage what was left of his pride, but it was over. He was done. I turned to look at him, and for the first time, he met my eyes with a look of pure, agonizing defeat. But the victory felt hollow. As the agents pulled Vance to his feet, he started laughing. It wasn't the laughter of a man who had lost everything. It was the laughter of a man who had left a trap, waiting for the final act. "You think this is over?" Vance spat, his eyes wild and bloodshot as they dragged him toward the exit. "You think you've scrubbed the city clean? You have no idea what's already in motion. You've exposed us, yes, but you've also just cleared the board for the people who are actually in charge, and they don't like being interrupted." He looked at me, a sickening, triumphant grin spreading across his face. "Check your car, sweetheart. Check your phone. Check your life. Because while you were busy trying to play the hero, someone else was busy making sure you'd never make it home." My phone vibrated in my hand, a notification from my private security team. A single ominous alert flashed on the screen. "Unauthorized access detected at your home. The security perimeter has been breached." The room felt like it was spinning. I realized then that my focus on the precinct had been a distraction, a calculated move to draw me out. I looked at the lead agent, who was now holding a burner phone Vance had dropped. He looked at me, his face pale. "Ma'am," the agent said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "we need to leave. Now. There's been a series of coordinated events across the city. Your penthouse. The power just went out, and we're getting reports of an armed entry." I turned toward the exit, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the lobby lights flickered and died. A single, red emergency light turned on, casting long, menacing shadows across the floor. Someone had hacked the building's infrastructure from the outside. We were trapped in the dark, and from the hallway, I heard the distinct, rhythmic click of heavy boots, and the sound of a mechanical slide being pulled back on a weapon. They weren't here to arrest me. They were here to finish what Vance started. The darkness was absolute, save for the rhythmic, pulsing crimson of the emergency lights that bled into the lobby like a fresh wound. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, a frantic drum against the sudden, heavy silence that had descended on the precinct. The agent beside me, the lead of the security team, instinctively stepped in front of me, his sidearm drawn, his movements sharp and tactical. "Stay behind me," he hissed, his voice barely audible over the distant, metallic clang of doors being forced open in the lower levels. "The entire grid is down. They didn't just breach your home. They've shut down the precinct's internal comms and locked the external exits. We are completely isolated." I clutched my phone, which was now dead, the battery drained by the massive data transfer I'd forced through the network. I was blind, but I wasn't helpless. I reached into my bag and pulled out a secondary, encrypted satellite uplink, a failsafe I hadn't touched in years. If the city's power was down, I needed to reroute the signal to the private security satellite I owned. "They aren't just here for me," I whispered, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "If they're willing to attack a police precinct to reach me, this isn't just about the organized scheme. They're trying to prevent the evidence from reaching the public servers. They want to bury the truth permanently." From the shadows of the long hallway, a voice drifted, a cold, smooth, and terrifyingly familiar tone. It was the voice of the man who managed my company's legal defense fund, the man I had trusted with my most sensitive personal data. "You really should have stayed in your office, Claire," the voice called out, echoing off the concrete walls. "You have such a penchant for being in the middle of everything, but you forget that even the most powerful person in the city has a shadow, and your shadow has been working for me for a long time." The agent beside me didn't hesitate. He pivoted, aiming toward the source of the voice. "Identify yourself. This is the city internal security team. Drop the weapon." There was a dry, hollow chuckle. "You're not speaking to the city anymore, Agent. You're speaking to the people who hold the keys to the city's debt. Step aside. We aren't here for you. We're here for the woman who thinks she can dismantle a decade of careful planning in an afternoon." The agent signaled to his men, and they began a flanking maneuver, moving through the darkness with lethal grace. But then a sound cut through the air, a sound that made my skin crawl. It was the hum of a specialized electronic jammer. All at once, our headsets went dead, and the agent's flashlight flickered and died. "They have military-grade gear," the agent muttered, his voice tense. "Ma'am, get behind the support pillar, now!" I moved, my heels silent against the floor, my breath coming in shallow, controlled gasps. I had to reach the terminal room behind the sergeant's desk. If I could get to the manual override, I could trigger a citywide emergency alarm that would force the civilian backup generators to kick in. It was a long shot, but it was the only way to signal for help. I crawled, keeping low, the smell of gunpowder and floor wax filling my nostrils. I reached the desk and felt along the underside for the hidden physical lever. My fingers brushed against something metallic, a small blinking device taped to the power supply. A bomb. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just a threat. They were planning to level the entire precinct to ensure that no one, not the evidence, not the officers, and certainly not me, would survive to testify. Suddenly, a hand reached out from the gloom and grabbed my hair, jerking my head back. I gasped, swinging my heavy bag at the figure, hearing the satisfying thwack of metal hitting bone. The person grunted, losing their grip. I scrambled backward, my back hitting the desk, and I felt the cold barrel of a weapon press firmly against my temple. "You're very persistent," the voice hissed, close enough that I could smell the metallic tang of blood on his breath. "But you're also very, very dead." I stared into the darkness, unable to see his face, but I could feel the malice radiating off him. He shifted his weight, preparing to pull the trigger. I knew I had one final move, the physical trigger for the building's fire suppression system. If I could pull it, the room would fill with a chemical foam that would blind him and force him to drop his aim. "Do it," I whispered, challenging him. "If you kill me here, the data won't stop. It's already on its way to the federal archives. You're not saving your organization. You're just marking yourself as the primary suspect in a murder investigation." He laughed, but his grip on the weapon tightened. "The federal archives? You think they care about a woman like you? You're a liability, Claire. Nothing more." His finger began to tighten on the trigger. I closed my eyes, counting down, waiting for the split second of hesitation. Just as the hammer of the weapon clicked backward, a massive explosion rocked the floor beneath us, sending us both sprawling. The lights didn't come back on, but the floor-to-ceiling windows of the precinct shattered outward, raining glass down on us. I looked up through the dust and haze, my vision blurred. Standing in the broken frame of the window was a dark figure, silhouetted against the night sky, holding something that hummed with a low, blue electric light. "Step away from her," the figure commanded, their voice distorted by a modulator. The man holding me recoiled, stumbling back toward the shadows. "Who the hell are you?" The stranger stepped into the room, their movements predatory and feline. They didn't reply. They simply fired a non-lethal, high-frequency projectile that caught the man square in the chest, sending him flying across the room and into the wall with a sickening crunch. The figure turned toward me, the blue light reflecting in their eyes. They reached out a hand, and as I took it, they leaned in close, their voice barely a breath against my ear. "You didn't think you were the only one who owned this city, did you? We've been waiting for you to clear the path. But now, you're the loose end we need to tie up." My pulse spiked. I hadn't been saved. I had just traded one enemy for a much more sophisticated one. Before I could pull my hand away, a sharp prick hit my neck, and the world began to tilt and dissolve into a sea of static. The world didn't fade to black. It burned into a searing, clinical white. I awoke not in a jail cell or a morgue, but in the sterile, soundproof observation lounge of a skyscraper I didn't recognize. A building that sat, quite literally, above the clouds of the downtown district. My head throbbed, and the memory of that sharp sting in my neck lingered like a cold ghost. I was strapped into a leather chair that felt like it belonged in a boardroom, not a dungeon. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, I could see the city below, its lights flickering back to life. The precinct, however, remained a dark, smoldering carcass in the distance. "You're awake," a voice said. It wasn't the voice of a criminal or a corrupt cop. It was the voice of Arthur Sterling, the reclusive patriarch of the city's oldest banking family, a man who had been dead for 10 years. Or so the obituaries had claimed. He stepped into the light, looking exactly as he had in the portraits hanging in the City Hall rotunda, save for a few weary lines around his eyes. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a tablet displaying the exact data I'd uploaded, the evidence that had just brought the entire organized scheme to its knees. "You played a dangerous game, Claire," he said, setting the tablet down. "You assumed the system was broken. It isn't. It's just mismanaged." "You," I breathed, my voice raspy. "You've been orchestrating the management from behind the scenes. The corruption, the fabricated cases. You used the precinct as a sieve to flush out anyone who threatened the status quo." He sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "I used the precinct to identify people with your level of ambition. You took a minor zoning error and turned it into a full-scale assault on the city's infrastructure. Most people would have paid the bribe and moved on. You dismantled the most powerful group of bad actors we've had in 20 years, using nothing but your wits and your ego." "I did it because I refused to be owned," I said, my body stiffening against the straps. "And that is why you aren't going to die," Sterling said, walking toward the window. "The city is a machine, Claire. It needs people like me to design the gears, and people like you to ensure they keep turning. The officers, the detectives, the scheme, they were maintenance workers who started stealing parts. They had to go." He pressed a button on the wall, and the restraints around my wrists hissed and released. I stood, my legs wobbling, and looked at him. "You're offering me a seat at the table," I realized, the absurdity of it hitting me. "You aren't killing me because you need someone to replace the people I just cleared out." "I need a successor," he corrected. "Someone who understands that the law is a tool for those who know how to wield it. You aren't just an owner of property anymore, Claire. You're an architect of the new order." I looked at the tablet. My thumb hovered over the delete button. I could erase everything, the corruption, the evidence, the path he was paving for me. But then I looked down at the city. It was a sprawling, chaotic entity that had been run by wolves for decades. If I refused, someone else would just take his place. Someone far worse than an old man with a vision. I looked at Sterling, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a victim or a CEO. I felt like the city itself. I picked up the tablet, but I didn't delete the data. I sent it to every major news network in the country, hitting publish before he could blink. His eyes widened, not with rage, but with a terrifying, slow-dawning admiration. "What have you done?" "I've reset the board," I said, walking toward the door. "You wanted a successor? You're looking at one. But I don't work for you, and I don't work for the system. I work for the city. And as of tonight, the city is no longer under your management." I walked out of that office and into the elevator, leaving him to watch as the news tickers below began to scroll with the names of every conspirator involved, including his own. I stepped out into the lobby of the skyscraper, where the morning sun was just beginning to touch the skyline. The precinct disaster was already the lead story, and the legal fallout had already begun. The officers who had mocked me, the detectives who had tried to bury me, they were already being hauled in, stripped of their power and their names. I walked to my car, a black sedan waiting at the curb. As I slid into the driver's seat, I checked my phone. It was flooded with messages, legal demands, and frantic calls from the mayor's office. I didn't answer a single one. I started the engine, the purr of the machine a reminder of the power I now held. I had been humiliated, threatened, and hunted, but I had come out the other side not as a casualty, but as the only person left standing. The city was finally truly mine, not because I owned the deeds, but because I had the courage to burn the house down to get rid of the rats. As I drove away, I didn't look back at the skyscrapers or the precinct. I looked straight ahead toward the horizon, where a new city was waiting for someone to finally lead it properly. The arrogance of those officers had been their undoing, but my arrogance? It was just the beginning of a brand new era. And for the first time, I knew exactly what I was doing.